One of these days, I'm going to do an edit where I take that free version of the Filmora Wondershare logo off of our intro.
One of these days.
Today is not that day.
Not
Hi,
today.
everybody. Welcome to So Local Live. I am Greg, as you probably know. That's Sam, as you probably also know, who is coming to us live from the Rebel base on. I forgot.
No, that actually is the name in
No.
the canon.
No, wait. I know it. If it's got a V in it.
Does it?
No, I can't remember. Yevon. Yes, from the Rebel base on Yevon.
Close enough, sure.
That's where they launched the attack on the Death Star in A New Hope.
You know, I was really afraid for a second that we were going to spend like half an hour just talking about this. Which like just takes me back to all the times I would start meaningless arguments with teachers and professors just to waste class time.
Right.
Usually
Yes.
that worked.
Yes. My Catholic high school experience was a lot like that. Arguing about whether animals had a conscience and sentience and were therefore eligible to go to heaven. With a religious teacher in 10th grade who was a former nun. I won very few of those arguments.
Wow.
Yeah, you're not going to win that stuff.
No,
I used up half
like
of a. Oh, now we're
I like
over
that better.
three. Now we're over here. We're over here. Moving around. Yeah.
So anyway,
half of a class time once arguing that Ronald Reagan was the devil. And my teacher didn't think that Ronald Reagan was the devil, so we had to talk about it for a half hour.
Right. Yeah, my daughter went to Catholic high school, and in the family tradition, they actually gave her an award at the end of her senior year for speaking truth to power, because she was the only pro-choice person in her Catholic high school. So it made for a very interesting few years of parent-teacher discussions. But I'm super proud of her because that was not an easy position to maintain. And it's because she's an extraordinary human being and a great mind. So there. Nice. I want to share this out. I want to make sure and thank our Patreon supporters. Thank you very much for keeping the internet flowing through the tubes and coffee flowing through my veins. And also thank you to Kelly Smith, Realtor, our amazing sponsor. By the way, she's got some videos up. I posted a couple of video links to her on the So Local Live page. I invite you to go check them out. Listen, Kelly is ethical as the day is long. And also really sweet and nice and funny. And if you don't want that in a realtor, I don't know what's wrong with you. Those are all good traits, and she's an amazing human being and our good friend. So please support our sponsors as they support us. That's how this ought to work. So I'm going to share this out to my feed. I got to mute the thing with the stuff. That's the wrong show. Boy, I am so organized. So organized.
So organized. We all are. This is a very professional show, really.
That's got to go right there. Share now. Okay. Also, I had my speakers on incorrectly. That may be why you guys, if you were getting a echo, that might have been why it is. That should be better now. Nice. Okay. So there. Hi, Virginia Rupert. Nice to see you in the comments with us today. We have a very special guest today who I haven't even mentioned yet. We have two very special guests today. This is Rabbi Brian Mann. Brian, welcome, and that is your partner. There is
Babka.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, so Brian is joining us today because how do I want to say this? What I want to say is I'm fairly new to the idea of linkage between anti-Semitism and the level or the ramping up and level of anti-LGBTQA rhetoric, threats, and violence. I didn't want to say threats of violence because we've now seen violence. We've seen a lot of violence, and there is a linkage between those two things. And I, as much as I am a student of World War II history and the rise of Nazism and fascism, I really didn't get that there was a direct link between those two things. And I think it's important for us to talk about that because as we see this rise in anti-gay, anti-trans rhetoric, legislation, attacks, I want us to understand that there's a long and very brightly highlighted history of fascists and nationalists and white Christian nationalists in many countries using that as an attack point to our Jewish neighbors, friends, and community members, and being woke to that has been an extraordinary thing for me, and I can't unsee it. And I think that's when we talk about the bigger idea of woke, that's what we're saying is wake up to what's actually happening around you. Wake up to the fact that there are systemic injustices, there are systemic violence problems, and they point in one direction. And we should expose that. That should be visible to us, so nobody can hide it anymore. And I think that's boy, the cat just tried to jump up on me and got me right in the ribs. She's so special. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And so I asked Sam to think about who we could bring on that could help us sort that out. And that would be Rabbi Brian. So Brian, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you are, what you do, and how you fit into this conversation.
Yeah, I am a queer rabbi who met Sam, I guess, 4-ish years ago now.
It's been 4 years.
Yeah, when I was working at a synagogue in Florida. I have since moved to Poughkeepsie, New York, and I'm now the campus rabbi at Vassar College.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I myself has like a long history of queer activism, Jewish activism, as Sam knows well, and one of our mutual friends, Bernice, knows even better the struggles that we went through related to faith-based organizing in Florida around some of those stuff. Yeah, and so when Sam reached out to be like, hey, do you want to have this conversation around intersections of queerphobia and anti-Semitism, I kind of was just like, yeah, it's obvious to me, so I'm not sure what we'll talk about, but happy to have the conversation.
Well, and this show is never an interview show; it's always a conversation show. So, I want to, especially, I feel like this is the kind of thing we don't do very often, where we actually start with a plan for a show. and so Sam is going to be dropping some links in the comments. I invite everybody to go and read the information that he's provided. He will be doing that, but I want to make sure that you, if you can, share this out to your social media presence, share this out to groups you belong to who you think are people that would be interested in or need to hear this conversation. And I want to invite people to ask questions in the comments, because these are two actual Jewish activists in our community, and they'll have some answers for us. So please jump into the comments, say hello, ask questions, pet the dog, whatever you want to do, interact. That's the ask from me today, is let's make this a thing that people will show other people when they need to have conversations about this topic or need to have their awareness level raised. Virginia already asked, is it the DeSantis definition? That's the funny thing for me, Virginia.
It's a great definition.
The definition
they accidentally gave a perfect definition.
I mean, guess what happens when you have to go to court and explain your view? Because it's on the record and you can be held accountable for it, you have to be accurate. And so that is an accurate definition that they gave in court of what wokeness is. Woke is being aware of systemic injustice particularly in our country in this conversation, and being willing and able to address those things, or wanting to address those injustices. So they had to admit in court that yes, there are systemic injustices in the state of Florida and in our country. So then their view then becomes, or their actions then become, an example of how not to do this. Like, oh yeah, we know there's systemic problems, but fuck you people, we don't care, right? We don't care enough to fix them. That's literally the Ron DeSantis position, and I think it's very important that we hang them on that petard. We hoist them on their own petard in this regard. Because I had a conversation in the comments with somebody who, Ron DeSantis is the best governor ever. He's keeping us safe, and I asked two things. First of all, keeping you safe from who exactly? And secondly, is it your contention that white Christians need to be protected? Because if that's true, you're woke to their struggle. So you're woke, right? You can't have it both ways. If you're going to be logically consistent, which is something that drives me batshit crazy about the other side, is you have to admit that you're woke, but only for certain things. And that's not how woke works. That's how we all come to this intersectionality conversation around our activism, which is the Jewish struggle and the Black struggle and the gay struggle and the immigrant struggle and the dreamer kids struggles are all related. The returning felon struggle, these are all related struggles for more people to be included in our democracy. At bottom line, that's what it all is. Like, giving gay people the right to marry. Really? Didn't they already have that right? If you think about it, if they're American born, right, then they have the right to marry. It shouldn't, the gender was never discussed in the Constitution or in the Declaration of Independence or any of the other founding documents. So therefore, they already had that vote. So who are we to say we gave them that right? People have fought and died for that right. And what I owe them is my support as a person that's part of the most privileged group of Americans there is. And I mean that chronologically and politically and just general makeup wise. That's what I feel like we can be doing better, is to understand these arguments and to carry them forth on behalf of our friends who are not as well considered as straight white Christian males. So there. All right. So Sam, I'm going to hand it off to you, and I'm going to just manage comments.
Take a breath.
I'm excited. I've had 2 iced coffees and a nap. So I'm very excited.
Well, that's not because you don't have the canvassing anymore to burn through all that caffeine.
That's it. It's just tickety. Yeah, just moving furniture around. That's all I've been doing. All right, so guys, take it away. I'm going to mute my mic and handle some comments, and let's have at it.
Cool. Sure. Well, I'll just say up front, we don't really have a program or anything. We're just kind of having a general conversation because this is a topic that, for whatever reason, I feel like a crazy person sometimes, ableism aside, because I feel like nobody knows about this. Nobody talks about it. And then the moment you bring it up, people always kind of go, oh yeah, that does make sense. Right? Just the notion that usually when we talk about anti-Semitism and the things that people say about us, there's always these notions of like degeneracy and we're corrupting society. And I mean, I think it's as simple as a question of how, because the how is almost always with queerness. The how is almost always with queerness. It's always an accusation that we are, how are we replacing society? We're doing it with queerness and abortion, but specifically queerness. Nazis were afraid that we were going to end their breeding patterns so that we could catch up to them. They said it all the time.
Right.
But I think that the main reason that Greg and I had talked about doing this episode, having this conversation, is because, as you and I know, unfortunately, the Department of Homeland Security recently put out a warning, essentially saying that there was imminent risk of domestic terror against the LGBTQ plus community, against the Jewish community, against migrant communities, and that these things were intersected. I mean, the same groups want to be targeting all of us. Just recently, this past weekend, we had a drag show in Lakeland that was assaulted by actual Nazis, hoisting swastikas that were saying anti-Semitic things, but, specifically targeting the queer community. So obviously there's an intersection there, and we got to talk about it. And, who better to talk about it than a actual queer Jew, not just a queer Jew, but a queer rabbi. So I guess I'll stop pulling a Greg and let you talk. Do you have any immediate thoughts on this topic?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that it's interesting for me to hear from people that this isn't obvious, right? Because I feel like I've been in many communities where it is obvious. And granted, those communities are often activist communities, Jewish and or queer communities.
Yeah.
But I also I one of the other things that comes to mind is how often people want to silo oppression, right? Either you experience queer phobia or you experience, anti-Semitism, or you experience racism, or you experience, right? And it's no, the whole idea of intersectionality is many of us can experience multiple of those things simultaneously. Hi, buddy. Yeah,
but
and
we'll make all the time there is for that. Dog interruptions are not a faux pas here. They're not a bug. They're a feature.
Indeed.
Right. It's also very clearly a Jewish dog in the name.
Bobka.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so and I think about especially kind of, for me, a couple things. One of the things that I'm coming into this conversation thinking about, which we don't necessarily have to get into, is the moments that I have experienced anti-Semitism in a queer space, right? Or queer phobia in a Jewish space, right? As kind of the antithesis of oh, this actually isn't obvious. Because if it was obvious, these oppressions wouldn't be perpetuated in these spaces, right? I remember there was a moment when I was at a bar in Ybor, out hanging out with people, and like I had just arrived. I was just grabbing a drink. I had like grabbed my first drink, and some, I don't know, probably like 18, 19-year-old kid turns to me and is like, I like it. It's funny. So you're good with money, right? And it took me like a good 10 seconds to figure out what they were talking about, because I wear a kippah all of the time. I wear a yarmulke all of the time. So like 95% of the time that I'm out and about, I just like forget that it's on my head because it's just always there. And I realized like, oh, okay. And I just like walked away. And it's one of those things where, I think one story of white Jews, especially, and Ashkenazi Jews, is by virtue of your whiteness, you are therefore privileged. So of course you don't experience oppression, right? And it's just one of the biggest, I think, misnomers out there that, and that's not to discount that, I forget how one of the things I used to say to different communities is like, we're no longer number one on the Nazi hit list. We're still on there, right? We're still on the Nazi hit list, but like Muslims and Black people have definitely moved above us on the Nazi hit list, and that's something we need to recognize and be in solidarity with, and be activists for. But I do think in some communities and in some conversations, the assumption is like we're not on the hit list at all, and it's like, okay, but how did we get there? Like, what happened such that people don't think we're on the hit list?
Well, I mean, I'll kick the hornet's nest. It probably has something to do with the way that the right wing and white supremacists fetishize Israel. I mean, it's that Israel fetish that's really, I think, contributing to a lot of it. Because even as these people are virulent anti-Semites, they love Israel.
Right. But they love Israel. They love Israel because they think if all of us move there, Christ will come back and we'll all get like genocided off Earth.
The only way to get out of the rapture and Armageddon is
like they don't love Israel because they love Jews. They love Israel because they think it's one mechanism to get all of us out of here. Right.
Well, I think they also love the militarism because, even not touching on Zionism, anti-Zionism, I think it's undeniable that Israel has sort of fetishized militarism as an aesthetic. The entire country is very much kind of warped by it. I think a lot about God. Did you guys ever see Sacha Baron Cohen's show in 2018 where he got the Georgian politician fired because he had this character, this bit that he was doing, where he was a retired Israeli commando and just kind of doing a bad Israeli accent and constantly talking about acts of graphic violence. He was fooling all of these Republicans into just being like, oh yeah, no, this is the guy. This is the guy. So like, I think that's a thing there. They love the militarism. They love the idea of like, yeah, I'm a warrior. We are all warriors and we are constantly at war, constantly under threat.
Right. And wherever you sit on the Zionist, anti-Zionist spectrum, like, I would hope anyone, wherever they are on that spectrum, would denounce the fact that there are literal fascists about to enter the Knesset, right? Yes. Like, there are Kahanists, and like happy to, whatever, post show or whatever, provide links to what that means. But, like, Mayor Kahana, like, terrorist attacked Muslims at prayer.
So this is the far right wing of Israeli politics, but they've got some sway in the Knesset. Is that correct?
Right, because Bibi couldn't form a coalition without them, and so for Bibi to get back in power, and this is also like election number 6 in like 2 years, like there's been so many elections at this point, and I think that's like I think part of what people don't fully get is like any Israeli politician can get out there and be like, I speak for the Jewish people when I say blah, 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 blah. In the same way that like any, in the same way that Trump can say, I speak for evangelical Christians when I say.
Right.
I haven't been an American who lived overseas during the Bush administration. I got blamed a lot for George Bush's viewpoints, even though I don't agree with virtually any of them. How could you
Right.
guys elect him twice? That I constantly got bombarded with that question, and it
Right.
had to be quick on my feet and thinking about answers. But again,
And I
this is
feel
that
like
idea that from outside of a community, it can look monolithic, but
right,
it's
and
not.
that's where I was going. That like, right, I feel like most Americans have that nuance that like,
No,
oh,
I
when an
disagree.
American politician says that they speak for all Americans, like, no, they don't,
Right,
and
right,
Right.
yet they don't then translate that nuance to other countries. And so when an Israeli politician says, "I speak for all Jews," a lot of
Right.
people will then turn to me or my Jewish friends or probably use them and say like, "Oh, well, you must agree with what that Israeli politician is saying, doing,
Constantly.
acting, whatever." And we're all just like, "No, we actually don't." Um,
Right.
and so I think like so many times people are just like talking past each other, are not willing to engage because they're not bringing the analysis and understandings that they have in other areas of politics and in other countries of politics to the Israel Palestine conversation for whatever reason.
mm.
Right. I mean, that
Well,
also speaks to such a common recurring theme in anti-Semitism, which is the mixed loyalties.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, of course, why we're trying
Which
to
like
destroy
is
Western society because of our
right.
mixed
Right.
loyalties.
Well, and the first
right.
the first real modern lesson that I had in this, and I've said this before, but I'll say it for Brian's benefit, so you know, kind of why I think this is an important conversation. I grew up in a Catholic household. Never made my
I'm sorry.
confirmation. My mom is still mad at me over that. Uh, but she will tell you that she was a young Italian American Catholic marrying into a white Southern Baptist family right around the
Mm,
time John Kennedy came to the awareness of most Americans. And
right.
I remember that when President Obama was running for the White House, the idea that he was a secret Muslim or that he would institute Sharia law, my
Right.
mom reminded me, we had these same conversations about John Kennedy around your dad's family's dinner table, that they were like, well,
Huh.
isn't he going to follow the Pope instead of following the
All
Constitution?
right.
She
Oh,
really literally
wow.
got asked those questions as a 19, 20-year-old married woman by older people. Now, what I can tell you for sure is that where that part of my family got that messaging was from the Baptist church. It was from the pulpit at their
Right.
And the
local,
Klan.
probably a guy who wore a hood at their rallies once a month. Like there was a
Right.
direct tie in Central Florida between Southern Baptists and the Klan. They were the Venn diagram of those people was a circle. It was as common as being a part of the Rotary Club or the Lions Club. Your membership in the Klan was pretty much assured if you were white and lived in
Mm,
Central Florida. And they did preach that from the pulpit, that the Jews were going to take over. As much as we all know that the Klan's focus of their ire for the 20th century was blackness, I can tell you the first Klan literature I ever saw was bill posted on the side of a fuel tank at a local gas station, and it was about the great Zionist conspiracy to take over America. And that this is 1978. We're not talking about ancient history here. This is in the
right.
late 70s and early 80s. I was seeing that locally, so
Right.
I've kind of had an awareness that that what the common thread here is white supremacy. The common thread
Right.
here is white Christian nationalism, and I don't think it's ever been as threatening as it is right now.
Right.
I think there have been moments when it peaked and we saw a terrorist attack based on that viewpoint, and we focused on it for a minute.
Yeah.
The Oklahoma City bombing is one of those. But for the most part, it's run under the surface for so long. I don't think people are ready to see it. And I got to tell you, I think what happened in Moore County, North Carolina this week, um, this is an overt act of violence that affected tens of thousands of people,
Right.
centered around a trans event, a public facing trans unity event, trans and gay unity event.
Mm,
That's a terrorist attack, and
Right.
right.
the circle of people that would support that attack and would support running Jews out of local politics. It's the same people.
Right. And like, what you were saying kind of about your history and then kind of we'll continue into that is, right? Like we see the resurgence now. Like I was in Charlottesville in 2017 with
Hmm.
white supremacists marching around me saying Jews will not replace us. Right? Like we're back,
Yeah.
and it feels weird to even say we're back because it never really went away. It
Right.
just
Right.
like went deep underground for long enough for them to organize and whatever. And like, Moore County is super scary, but I'm also seeing, and it's unclear where it's coming from, but a lot of my friends right now, like literally today, are posting a like report the LGBTQ event in your area so we can come and
Yes.
Right.
like
So
enact
that
violence
website
and
actually
or
got
shut it
shut
down.
down.
Oh, it got
Did
shut
it?
down.
That's
Yeah,
good.
so we
Wow, that was
overloaded
quick.
it by posting full movie scripts
Free
and
scripts.
all kinds of
Amazing.
shit. And I think a few people actually set up AI bots that were sending the addresses of prominent Texas politicians.
Nice.
Amazing.
Nice.
Yeah, so
Was
it
that
shut
down
down.
with you all, or where? Like, was that
Texas.
nationally? Oh, it's
I
Texas.
believe that
Okay,
was based in
Believe
Texas.
so.
Yeah.
got it.
So one of my favorite forms
Which,
of,
like, of course,
of
it's
rebellion.
Texas because
One of my favorite
Of
forms
Texas.
of ridicule is one of my favorite forms of protest is ridicule, right? Is
Right.
making fun of the
I
other
mean,
side.
right.
And
That's a
that's a
Jewish
pretty good
tradition.
example, right? Of pasting in the entire script of Jerry Seinfeld's B movie into the buffer for that thing.
Right. Which, like, also, like, I had friends that, like, there's, there's the whole set of very right-wing Jews that will go after any progressive, college student, faculty member, whatever, in the same way, right? Like, report
Right.
here, the, like, faculty member that, dares to say there's an occupation in Israel, right? And like in the same way, like same activism, people will just like overload it
Right.
with like fake names, nonsense, right? Like,
well, honestly, having grown up in a pretty strong pro-Israel environment, the people around me, my parents and others, Jewish family members, like where they started to lose me was the failure to recognize that what they're doing to the Palestinians is exactly what was done to the Jews. It's hard to reconcile ghettoizing a subsidiary population of your country when that's exactly what happened to you. Not just in World War II, as we now know, in many other spheres throughout Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years. And like when we were just talking about the Jews will not replace us, the blood and soil bullshit. I've just finished listening to Rachel Maddow's multi-part podcast, Ultra, about the fascist and anti-democracy movement in the late 30s and during World War II. And gosh, guess what? The words are literally the same. Right? America First is literally the name of the white supremacist movement from that era.
Right.
It's not even like they subtly changed the name so we might not catch it. Which says to me that there's intentionality in using those phrases and words. It's to try and tell those people that are sort of leaning that way that your grandfathers and your great grandfathers were right.
Right.
In the 30s, you want to go for democracy. So
what was that meme that went around that was like the people that protested Ruby going to school are the same people that don't want you to know they protested Ruby going to school, and that's why they're against critical race theory or whatever.
Yeah, they don't want to get caught.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, Greg, I feel like you and I were just talking about it maybe on the last episode, but as I love reminding people, there was a very prominent Nazi movement in America. And that included a Nazi day camp that had tens of thousands of families back in the late 30s, early 40s. And when they got shut down because of tax issues, not because they were Nazis, all of those families just kind of went home.
Right.
They just went home.
Yeah, nobody was legally accountable. And in fact, it wasn't just New York. I know that when we were talking about that, you were talking about New York, California. Whole towns were named after this America First movement. Like they retook German town names in towns in Southern and Central California. So it was in the liberal elite coastal places that this actually happened. God only knows how much of it happened down here in the South, where nobody was pointing it out or infiltrating them because it was accepted and normal, right? But the one of the points that Maddow made about that period in her podcast or in interviews about the podcast is that what stopped that was people like us calling it out, was people like us publicizing it, putting it in newspaper stories, putting up posters in neighborhoods that said, if you've been attacked because of your Jewishness, write us a letter, or phones were less common then. But the point is that she says that it wasn't the Justice Department, certainly, or the president, certainly, that stopped that movement.
Right.
It was everyday people who invested the time and the risk of confronting those groups and calling them out publicly. There were journalists and housewives and taxi drivers and a whole bunch of other people that did the hard work of fighting fascism then, and that's who has to do it now, through civic means.
Right. I mean, one of my, one of the lessons that I had to learn from friends of mine, especially in Charlottesville, but not only, is like, look, like voting is not going to save us. The Democrats are not going to save us. Like, Charlottesville had a Democratic governor at the time. Like, he did nothing. Right. Like, there were many ways that like permits could have been denied. Right. Or there were plenty of opportunities, and still to this day, right, because of freedom of speech, no one is willing to like block permits or deny whatever, right? Like, I have fucking white supremacists like demonstrating outside the mall, like, that I drive by with all their pro-Trump and whatever, right? Like, they won't bring out a swastika, but because they know not to, or a Confederate. Well, have they brought out a Confederate flag? I think they might have, actually. And it's just like, okay, like, so then that doesn't work, right? So we can't rely on government.
Yeah.
And then the other side of it is, right, especially post-Charlottesville, but not only, how many articles that we saw that were just like, oh, your friendly neighborhood white supremacist next door, right? And so too, like, I think it's happened less with January 6th because people are taking that more seriously. But just the amount of like profiles that were like, they're not really a white supremacist, they're just a nice white suburban family, and let's talk about them.
Right.
And let's interview them. Right. And like all of this platforming that was trying to normalize. Right. And it was like so weird and frustrating. And
so why I want to try and kind of steer us back into the track that
yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. Listen, I'm good for all of this, but
yeah,
I need you guys to lay out why there is this linkage between gay rights and anti-Semitism. Why does that work? And where do you think that comes from? Like what instructs that?
So I've got an immediate thought. I mean, I talk about this all the time. Why anti-Semitism? Why is it so much like the baseline, like baby's first bigotry move, right? and I think that one of the reasons for it, above all else, chiefly with Ashkenazi Jews, just because we are, white passing, we don't necessarily read as other, but we are among you. And I think that's a very terrifying thought for a lot of people. I mean, you look at like a lot of classic horror, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, things like that, how afraid people are of the idea of like the enemy is around us and we can't even tell. Right. And if you think about another community that can do that, often has a focus on the concept of passing or not and being in the closet, is the queer community. These are two people that very typically do not necessarily, oh God, what is the verbiage that I'm looking for? They don't necessarily express that they are other, that we are different. We're not just all walking around in yarmulkes or in full drag or whatever. Right. And that makes it very easy to demonize us. And, it lets people kind of scratch that weird matrix itch that they have where they want to believe that they're in a movie and that the causes for their own inadequacies are this grand, cinematic experience, a la the Matrix. You gotta look for the signs, you gotta look for the nose, you gotta look for this, you gotta tell for the names. These are the names, these are the codes.
Very conspiracy theory friendly.
Yeah. He doesn't want you to know he's Jewish, but his name is Rosenberg. Oh my God.
So I'm gonna interject just to come at this from a this checks out sort of statement here.
Sure.
One of my favorite books about writing is Dance Macabre by Stephen King, which is actually his nonfiction book about the horror genre. Right. And it was actually the syllabus for the course he taught on horror fiction writing at University of Maine, I think in the early 80s. It is a fantastic book. If you like movie tropes, not even just horror movie tropes, but he breaks down the sort of the what's the word I'm looking for? The archetypes of evil in movies, right? The haunted house, the vampire, the mummy, revenants, the man created monster, the Frankenstein thing, big hairy monsters, which is King Kong, Mighty Joe Young, and Bigfoot, which has to come up in every show. It's the rule. And he makes a point about sort of the uncanny valley, this idea that when we're thinking about artificial people, right, the closer it looks to human but isn't, the more uncomfortable we are. Like, we can see the humanity in a gorilla or in a puppy, but when we see something that's very close to human but isn't, it makes us very uncomfortable. That's called the uncanny valley, the recognition of something that's very near to us. And I think that may overlay this exact thing that Sam just brought up about passing. Right? That's what makes us the most uncomfortable, is someone that could be white, but our cultural deterministic idea is that they aren't, right? So they're trying to fool us. It's uncanny. It's not natural, and that's wrong. But I think that's in play in a lot of that ideation. And I think you just hit the people in the closet thing. That hits that right on the head. Whatever you're in the closet for, whatever nonconformity or difference you express or don't express but hold secretly, is much scarier to us than something that's right out in the open. Gosh, that's beautiful. That's conversation over. We win.
I mean, I think I think one of the other routes is this kind of like vision of this like mythic primordial, like time where everyone
how
was
things
the
used
same.
to be.
Right. Everyone was the same, how things used to be, right? Like, and I also want to make sure that we get out in this conversation that like it's easy to say like, oh, this was Nazism and this all came from Europe and like it was never really here, but like you can see it in our founding documents too. You can see it in the founding fathers. And so like, but sticking with Nazism for a moment, right? Like the Aryan race and the mythic like time where, Germany, which also, like whatever, the idealized whatever, right? And for
I think there's just a shit ton of Americans that think that the idea of an Aryan race started with Hitler, because that's how we learned about it, right? We learned about it reading about Nazi Germany in the 1940s, 20s, 30s, 40s.
And I mean, not a historian, right? But I think that is a fair claim. What I'm trying to say is that
no, not claiming that. I'm saying that people imprint that it started then because that's the period that we learned about first.
Right, exactly. Fair.
And they may have stopped learning at that point, which we also find about the Confederacy.
Right, exactly. And so, one of the analyses that I'm still figuring out for myself how much I want to lean into it is Jews are not a race, but anti-Semitism is a racialized hatred.
Yeah.
Right?
Open that up a little bit.
Right. So the reason why people claim that what's really important for saying Jews are not a race is the very lived reality of multiracial and multicultural Jews, right? To claim that Jews as a whole are a race is to then erase Black Jews, right? Or Asian Jews, or Latinx Jews, or so on and so forth. Or at least to claim Ashkenazi Jews are its own unique race, I guess. But anti-Semitism being racialized hatred gets into kind of what we're talking about, right? This idea that the Aryan race is a master race, or the claim of white Christian nationalism, right? Like going back to what we were all talking about, like Jews will not replace us. What does it mean that Jews are going to replace you? That like somehow are going to have like more babies in more numbers, and our blood or DNA or something is somehow diametrically different than your blood or DNA or whatever, which like we all know is not at all true. But like all of this kind of
and that bean counting method was central to how the German Nazis, sorted for who went to a camp and who did not. And eventually it got, more and more people went and less people didn't. And that's I think that's something that we should pay attention to. That sorting process, when it starts, doesn't necessarily start with Jewishness. It starts with gay being a choice, with trans people making a decision, with a lifestyle. So that lifestyle is abhorrent. Therefore, anybody that practices it certainly or supports it is suddenly now you can put them in the bean counting stack that's going to the camps. Right. And I mean, I'm not dancing lightly over that. I want to make sure that that's how it starts. It doesn't start with internment camps and concentration camps and death camps. It starts with sorting people into acceptable and non-acceptable existences.
Right. Because you know, like long before the camps in Germany, we had, you know, the law saying you can't teach, you can't own businesses, you can't, which you know, go back far enough in U.S. history, and we also see that in various ways, right?
Direct ways, like, you know, overt, direct,
exactly.
on
Quotas, barring some country clubs, right? Like, and I think to some extent, it's all from the same mentality, right? Like the founders of this country were white Christian men, and therefore the idealized person is a white Christian man, and if you're not that, like not only white Christian man, but white Christian man in the way that we conceive of Christianity. Because let's be real here, like they would have just as many problems, right? Like Greg, you mentioned you know, like you came from a Catholic family, you're here on this progressive podcast. All of these Christian nationalists are going to have just as much of a problem with you as they would with me or Sam the moment you open your mouth.
Worse because he's
maybe the only difference might be that I don't practice the Catholic faith. I don't talk about my Catholic faith or my Catholic upbringing, so I'm much less targeted. I'm not as visible in my. But there's an otherism there, and
like you would be like the race trader, right?
Essentially, they would ask my mom questions like, "Is it true that y'all worship idols?" Because in the Baptist view and the Klan view, saints, you know, statues of saints are idols. Right. So they were idolaters, which is also a sin. Right? So there were lots of ways to condemn Catholicism. And, you know, like,
but I mean, I guess what I was saying by that is less about like your difference on Catholicism and more that like, even if you are a progressive Christian nationalists are still going to come for you.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Right. I mean, look at Andy Oliver, right? You know,
constantly. Well, I mean, as someone who has actually run defense and security essentially at Allendale when, you know, neo-Nazis show up and these Christian nationalists show up, I've heard all of the lines. They hate him. They hate him more than they could ever hate me or you or any amount of drag queens.
Because again, he is the quote-unquote race trader.
That's very true. Even though, Christian churches in my community. Up here in Newport Richey, we have, I think, 2 churches now that openly accepting, you know, have Trans Day of Remembrance services at their churches. Listen, the level of hatred and threat that they get is far greater than, and I have a public face. I'm out here, you know, saying this stuff on the internet. I get less threat than they do. Right. The local bookstore owner that hosted our drag queen story hour for a while has had a harrowing few years because of that. She stopped doing it a year and a half ago at her store because there were huge threats, and not just to her, but the entire, you know, building she rents in.
And I mean, obviously,
visibility.
Right. And I mean, like, obviously everyone needs to make their own decisions around that. And I'm not here to say like, no, you always have to do the thing, whatever. But like, you know, one of the many messages that have been going around and often goes around, right? It went around after Pulse. It's recently gone back around Club Q is like, choosing queer visibility and queer joy is always a choice against queer safety, right? Maybe not, depending on where you live, right? And I've had relative privilege and safety to feel like it's not always been a risk to my safety to be, you know, like, look, all of my kippot are Pride kippot. Like my current one is modeled after Progressive Pride flag. My Shabbat one has like a rainbow swirl around a Star of David, right? Like I make it very clear and very obvious who I am wherever I am. And I've definitely had times in my life where, again, like as an individual, not as a business, not as someone who is responsible for other people, right? I don't have kids, right? Like I want to put all of the qualifiers out there. But like I've definitely had times where, you know, parents, sometimes well-meaning friends, sometimes whatever, like oh, are you sure you should be out right now with your kippah? Are you sure you should be out right now in this shirt? Are you sure you should be out right now? And like my response has always been like, that's what they want. Right? What they want is for me to take my kippah off. What they want is for me to never go out publicly in this shirt. What they want is for me to be afraid of holding a partner's hand in public. What they want is, right? And, you know, I'm definitely like, I get it. I totally get it. I have friends that are on team, like, hide for safety, protect ourselves, you know, come back up for air when things have calmed down. And I'm definitely on team, like, louder and prouder and shove it in their face even more. Right? Like, you want to shoot up a clear club? Cool.
Right.
Like, fuck you. I'm gonna, you know, party harder that weekend and bring out like more of my queer friends to that very same club. Right? Like, you know.
Let me dip in there to say that when Jonah, our bookstore owner here, Jonah, the bookstore owner.
Yeah.
Wow. I never even caught that rhyme before. When she was hosting the Drag Queen Story Hour event, there were huge, loud, shitty protesters outside screaming things at children that should never be screamed at children. It was really awful. And one of the things I think we needed to see was our local police jurisdiction, in this case, the Pasco County Sheriff's Office, show up and not do anything to make anyone safer. Like, I think, and I don't think we should be risking, you know, gay and trans lives to make that point clear. But it was obvious to anybody who was a neutral observing that the police weren't going to do shit until somebody got physically attacked. And then when that did happen, who they arrested was threatened to arrest was a local trans activist who lost her temper. And after a full day of hearing, you know, people scream at children, they're going to cut your penis off and things like that. Which is really what you want at a children's book reading event. You know, only one side was doing that, and the police were only protecting that side. And I think that part of what I value about you doing that, you being that out and that confrontational, is people need to see what happens when that's the matrix in play. People need to see that, no, the police are not going to take the side of the gay and trans folks in any of these conversations. And my personal viewpoint on that goes back to the 1970s, when I watched friends who were trying to come out get hassled, get arrested, you know, get beaten by someone who found out they were trans, and then the cops say, well, it was just a lover's quarrel between two faggots, right? You know, watching that authoritarian lean away from protecting the vulnerable people and into protecting the already protected and privileged class. That's maybe the first lesson I ever got in that kind of behavior. There are not enough Black people in my community then for me to see that part of that matrix, but seeing it among gay and trans people was definitely, that's a real thing. And it's ongoing. It's never stopped. And I think it's accelerating.
I mean, and that's why, like, you know, what we saw, and I heard it as well, right? Like that, you know, activists were okay up until Black Box, right? Activists are okay up until they're willing to throw hands, up until they're willing to like really put their bodies on the line to defend the most vulnerable. And like, I very much, right? And like, we hear it all of the time from politicians, from family members, from, you know, whatever. And I remember really having the analysis and like for myself, because I used to very much be like staunchly nonviolent, staunchly whatever. And like, especially at Unite the Right, but definitely other times too, I've been like, look, if I either don't have the skills to, or the desire or the ability to throw hands, I need someone next to me who will. Because if someone's coming at me,
I bring Sam along everywhere I go.
Right. And I remember like really going on, like, I think one of my more viral posts that came out after Unite the Right was a praise of Black Box, because they were getting so much shit. And I was like, you all need to realize, like, many of us would have died without them. Like, literally. Many of us would have been trampled, would have been
cops,
you know, right? Like,
so we're coming up this week on there's an event in Polk County, Lakeland, Florida. where they were already been surrounded by Nazis a couple of times, and the again, Polk County Sheriff's and Lake Police showed up.
If I can interrupt for a second and just mention, when that happened, the cops did nothing. There were police on site, and they just sat there while people hid inside.
Well, guess why? Because if you take off their vests, their shirts, many of them have tattoos that indicate they're part of the problem.
I bring this up all the time. There's a website, it's not active anymore, but all police used to be very active on. It's called LEO Affairs, Law Enforcement Officer Affairs, and it was a web forum for cops. And the things that they would say about Jane Castor, mayor of Tampa, noted lesbian, would make your eyes melt out of your head. They fucking hate her. They are horrifically homophobic. And they complained about being at Pride when they had a float at Pride.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just getting on that all the time.
I feel weird, always bringing up the memes and the viral posts, but that's how I feel like a lot of, especially my friends and family who aren't embedded in activist communities, really get some of the messaging. And one of my favorites that went around, I think this was a few years ago at least, was want to know why police never do a shirtless calendar like firemen do? It's because of all of the Nazi tattoos that you would see.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, Virginia points out that those are performative alliances, and the first time I got invited to a local Trans Day of Remembrance gathering in front of Metro Inclusive Health down here in Holiday, Florida, the Pasco County Sheriff showed up there, and everybody was welcome to speak, and he said, we're a lot like you because that we get persecuted because we're police officers, and I was the next person to speak, and I told him, you get to take off that uniform when you go home at night. You are making a choice to be a police officer, and all the good and bad that comes with that. That's a little different than being who you are and being persecuted and injured for that. Right. I know, Sam. I know.
No, I remember.
That's exactly the look I gave him. I felt,
motherfucker, there's no such thing as a blue life. Right. Your life isn't blue. You're not blue.
Yeah.
No, I remember.
You're not an avatar.
I forget. Was it in response? It might have been in response to the Tree of Life shooting. I don't remember for sure, but there was a big Jewish community vigil in Florida that, Sam, I don't know if you went. It was at, I think it was at the big conservative synagogue in
which one?
I will not remember the name. But anywho, the one that's closer to Tampa area.
I don't think I was, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I'm there with the other rabbis and with the other Jewish leaders and whatever. And I walk up, and it is every single door had at least 2 officers in essentially riot gear.
Right.
And I'm sitting there, and I was just I want to go home. I am I can't have a panic attack right now, but if I could have a panic attack right now, I would be.
They didn't make you feel
it was
safe?
Because it was close enough to the last time I saw that was Unite the Right, and who were they protecting? The white supremacists, right? And so I was sitting there, and I was just I don't know, right? And there's a rabbi that Sam and I know relatively well, who thank God he was there, because he was kind of saving grace, and we were able to he was able in many little ways to calm me down and to
are we talking about the one and only Rabbi Jason Rosenberg?
Indeed, we are.
Dear friend, love him dearly.
Yeah, and he's great. And
I feel like from this conversation and from what Sam has said, I think I just need to hang out with more rabbis. I think that I'm feeling
hang out with my 2.
Yeah,
I'm lucky I have some really good rabbi friends.
Yeah, and I and if that was my reaction, right, as a person who in many other times in my life, I had seen police as protective or as non-threatening or whatever, if my reaction to these police in riot gear like how much more so any given Black Jew coming to that event?
Right.
How much more so any given Muslim who's trying to show up in solidarity, but then that's what they see and
a threat vector.
They're not going to walk in because that's what they say, right?
Yet,
like
Arab Jews. There's Arab Jews, and even
right.
honestly, I've met Ashkenazi. My dad gets stopped in airports by Homeland Security because he passes as Arab, whatever that means. He's Ashkenazi as you or me, but I mean, you know, the olive skin tone, a couple days in the sun, and boom, you're profiled.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out. You know, we're in a weird space now where I want people to like you made a really good point, Brian, about showing up, about, you know, making the decision to be out, and what they want is for people to shut up, shut down, climb back in the closet, not be seen.
Right.
Because then it's easier to ignore again those social injustice things that make you woke, right? It's easier to stay asleep when nobody's pounding on the closet door, right? But I come to this understanding of linkage and homophobia from my work in counseling, which is mostly with perpetrators of domestic violence against their intimate partners, right? I'm a batterer intervention program facilitator for a little better than a decade. And there is a clear link between homophobia and domestic partner intimate violence against women by men. In other words, yes, we know there is domestic violence within the gay community, but frankly, who I was instructing were men. It's a men's batterer intervention program, and overwhelmingly, my clientele were men that were in heteronormative heterosexual relationships. However, towards the end of that time, we did have 4 or 5 clients that were in trouble for beating up their gay partner, their gay spouse, right? So we were invited to have discussions about that. And homophobia is one of the ways that men shape boys. One of the ways that they control the behavior of boys. You know, the idea that wearing pink nail polish means you're gay. No, liking to have sex with other boys means you're gay. That's a different thing, right? You know, but I would find myself explaining this to men over and over and over again, because what we understood was that interrupting that cycle of homophobia is actually better for everybody, men and boys and women included, that there's less violence when there's less homophobia in the world. Isn't that funny? But that shaping behavior, honestly, when we have the conversation about guns and mental health and mass shootings, overwhelmingly who's committing those is men. And overwhelmingly it's young men. There's something wrong with how we raise our boys, to see everybody as a threat to their ability to have sex, the whole incel idea. All of those things kind of fester into a young man's mind if there's not some other messaging going on. So I guess what I wanted to say was, what I love is I will always do my best to be forward, to be out there and not be in fear of what might happen. And I was the MC at our first Pride event here in Pasco County, and something we paid no attention to until like 3 days before the event was threats of violence at the event. And I spent the whole day pretending not to be worried about somebody stepping close to the stage with a pistol and taking it out and shooting people. I didn't think that was going to be a problem. I didn't think of that as even remotely being a problem until the day of the event. And then I spent the whole day terribly concerned about who was approaching the stage, not particularly for my safety, but because, you know, what that would have done to everybody there, you know, regardless of whether they actually got shot. The threat of that was very real that day. And guess what? Local police, they really didn't give a shit. They really did not. They did not intervene in any meaningful way. They didn't go to the home of the person that made the threats. They just waited to see who showed up at Pride with a gun. You know, you know. So I just want to say that I understand we all have some personal fear about this, but frankly, you know, who do we value in the long term in any movement is the people that ally themselves with the threatened population and show up and stand between them and the danger. And we saw that during the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen it over and over. We saw it all the way back to and including, you know, gay pride parades when they first started, the gay rights movement. When it first started, it was allies that put themselves in harm's way to support another population. The Freedom Riders come to mind. You know, white privileged kids from the Northeast getting on buses to the South where they got firebombed and beaten up and sometimes killed, was an important message. It wasn't the most important message, but it was a way of showing other people that there was a different way to be than anti. Right, there was a place for you to be an ally and be a supportive and strong ally by bringing attention to the struggle, by making sure that people felt at least nominally safe. So we can do that.
And and
we
that's where I wanted to make
safe.
sure. Right, and that's where I wanted to make sure we went, is that like, right, there are many different levels of.
Now, Dave pulled the first Pasco Pride, which was at Sims Park in Newport Richie. This is I think a year or two before the one that happened in Land O'Lakes. Sorry.
Right. And what I was just going to say is just kind of like to hit that point a little bit more home of like, right, like I feel like a lot of people, myself included, when I was an early activist, felt like showing up by definition meant being in the streets or putting my body on the line or somehow like really being public and out there. Where like, when the hostage situation in Texas happened with the rabbi down there, like, I felt like I was living in two very different social media worlds. The Jewish social media, where everyone was like terrified and having prayer vigils and figuring out what the fuck is happening. And the non-Jewish social media, where like no one was even aware it was happening or talking about. Right. And like showing up can be simply, a private, like if you don't want to be public at all, check in on your Jewish friends when you hear about something that happens. Like, are you okay? What's happening? What's going on? Same thing, queer friends, right? Slightly more public, talking about it and posting about it yourself. Hey, did you know this is happening? What's going on? Like, we need to do better. We need to whatever, right? And then there are like many levels from like, I feel like, we've all talked about how like politicians aren't going to save us. But if that's your route, if your route is like advocacy and canvassing and that work, great. If your route is, checking in with queer-owned bars and businesses, hey, what do you need? Do you need, a community safety group that will show up at your doors for, whatever you need, right? Like, anyway, I'm like rambling at this point, but that's all to say that, that's all to say that
you would be surprised how quickly we fill up an hour.
Yeah.
Right. Here we are. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Rabbi Brian Mann, for coming by and hanging out with us. We always say you're welcome anytime. If there's something that you want to talk to us about that you think our community should know about, please give us a shout. Samurai and Samurai? Samurai me? I don't know. me or Sam, get in touch with us. And we'll make it a point to make some time for you. We do this usually every Monday or Tuesday afternoon, depending on what's happening with our work weeks. Sam, thank you so much for inviting Brian along here. And
of course, I mean, who else was I gonna call, man?
I don't know. All them other rabbis. I know you guys have.
That's true. I do suddenly know a lot of rabbis. I'll tell you what. There's nothing that makes it easier to start like drifting back towards Judaism than just being friends with rabbis. Makes the process much smoother.
I feel like I've been missing out, honestly.
You have been missing out.
All right.
But, listen, before we wrap up, though, I just want to share some things because I feel like we've kind of been touching on these themes throughout the entire episode of Cops Don't Keep Us Safe. Who is us? Us is anyone marginalized or threatened? There's a couple stories that come to mind. Number one, notably, back in the 40s when American Nazis, as we discussed, were still becoming much more of a powerful force, the mayor and DA of New York literally hired the Jewish mafia and said, hey, will you go beat the shit out of Nazis? And they waited until the Nazis were all in one place, in one building, and they just dragged them out and beat the shit out of them in broad daylight. That worked. Okay, that worked. Other story I wanted to bring up is about a great place called Tenacious Unicorn Ranch. It's actually where the girl who wrote our theme song is currently staying. It is a trans friendly ranch out in Colorado, I believe. Yes. And when they initially founded and, had alpacas and, was very much centered as like a therapeutic place for queer folks to go and, not hide, but, heal and thrive. Right. They were not armed. And then they started getting harassed. So they armed up. Okay, they armed up. They didn't go into towns or anything. But if you showed up on their property, they would point a gun in your face. And I tell you what, they're not having issues anymore. So I see these things and the story that Rabbi Brian shared, and I just want people to ruminate on it. I'm not going to suggest what you do, but I want you to think about that. Historically, cops don't show up. Cops are not helpful for us. And people that take community defense mindfully and take it upon themselves, in good faith and solidarity and good communication with people, not just showing up as colonizing heroes or anything like that. You're not the adventurers, but people that show up and physically defend folks are historically what saves lives. That's it.
And I'll just add to that, like, if you are a business owner, you get full control over who comes in, right? There was another viral story that went out about a bar owner where like a white supremacist was trying to like come in and drink there, and like the moment he saw him, he was like, "No, get the fuck out! You're not welcome here."
Right.
And there was someone that was like there that was just like, "What's going on?" And he was like, "Look, the moment you let one in, they bring all of their friends, and then next thing you know, you're bartending a white supremacist bar." Yeah. Right? Like, so to a restaurant, it only takes one. So to a bookstore, right? And so like there are many, many ways to spot the signs. Like some are very obvious, related to tattoos or shirts or slogans. Some are less obvious, but there are resources for you that I can point you to. I'm sure Sam can point you to.
Focus on Norse mythology.
Right. And so like if you are in one of those positions where you are a business owner, where you do have control over a public or semi-public space, like, it goes back to kind of, they have like freedom of speech versus no platforming, right? They have a right to say or wear whatever they want. They don't have a right to access your space while doing so. You have full control to say, no, you're not welcome here if those are the views you're going to espouse.
Right on. All right. So like this has been a difficult way for me to think of things. This last week, I've been very mindful of, we all have a different moment of crisis when we understand that violence is inevitable. And, my personal journey is to push that moment as far down the road as I can through other means, right? That's why, I'm all about civic engagement that works to change this. And it means a lot of people showing up publicly, not necessarily at the voting booth, although that's one, as you say, as my friend Sam Ronan would say, there are many, many paths on the road to justice, right? And so that's like, I don't want anybody to take away from this conversation one way or the other. Like you're going to have to decide when you think the threat is big enough for you to arm yourself and defend yourself. We all hopefully don't have to have that experience. Many of us have had that experience, and we know how traumatic that is to experience. Like the twice that I've had to physically, be ready to defend myself or my family with a firearm were gut wrenching. They were terrible days, and I puked, and I was miserable, and I hated that it had to happen, but I knew that it did. So, but I do feel like not having the conversation about when we get to that point is a fool's errand, because I really do feel like we are going to get to that point. And there are some weeks when I don't feel that way, and some weeks when I feel extra that way. And this is a week where I'm feeling extra that way because there have literally been attacks, directed at gay and trans people. Who, by the way, the people in Moore County, North Carolina, there are thousands of people. Thousands. Speaking of, right? That, hey, Lord. if you're on on some sort of a medically necessary electronic device, you got hurt by that. So they didn't just aim to hurt gay and trans people with that attack. They literally hurt lots of people in their own community. That's literally what terrorism does. That's what terrorism is. So that was an act of terrorism. And if we're looking at active acts of terrorism happening in our communities, then we're all going to have to determine for ourselves how to make ourselves and our circle safe. And what I hope for is that our circle of empathy is bigger than just our immediate family. I think that's a big problem for many folks, is they only think of themselves, their children, whoever lives in their house, or whoever lives in their church, right? My circle of empathy is much bigger than that. And I think that that's the key, is increasing the size of my circle of empathy by being aware of who I am and where I came from and what bad messaging I got, and fighting to make sure that other people don't have to fight for that, we can just be more inclusive. Who's hurt by gay marriage? How is your non-gay marriage hurt by gay marriage? How is your non-trans existence hurt by someone who is trans? Until you can explain that to me in something that isn't because God said so, we're going to have a different kind of conversation. So I just wanted to drop that in the conversation about,
of course,
we got to show up at these events and be brave.
And we got to show up, and we also have to stop fighting amongst ourselves. I know we've been trying to. I know we've been trying to end the episode for like the last 10 minutes, but it does make me think of another thing, that in Nazi Germany, there was a movement called the Iron Front. I believe it had a German name, but I'm not going to use that name right now. It's fine. But the Iron Front would militantly resist Nazis. The problem was that it comprised of a coalition of people that we can consider the left, from like the center left all the way just on the border of communism. And that was the issue. They hated communists, and the communists hated them. So while they were fighting in the street with Nazis, they were also fighting in the street with communists, which means that we had a divided left. So when the Nazis took power, they killed both.
Right.
They both got fucked because they couldn't get over it.
And you had sub-factions that were willing to sell out the other sub-faction to the big enemy.
Correct.
Let's not do that, friends. Let's remember not to do that. And like you said, everybody has a role in a path, And I've been having some difficult conversations lately with people who are more militantly minded than me in this moment. And that's tough because no, it wasn't you actually. Although we've had conversations like that, what we understand about each other is you have one set of boundaries and lines, and I have a different one. And that's okay, because we're different people doing different jobs within this big movement for more inclusion.
Sure, but I mean, I will say I lean more on Brian's side of, I don't necessarily need to be the one doing the violence, but you know what? It's nice to have
somebody better be ready.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I'm so glad, Brian. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Bringing your lovely dog along with you, like you had any choice. As it is with most pet owners, they require attention when they require attention, and home broadcasting means somebody may get to see your cat or your fish or your dog. All right, Sam, anything else that you needed to share with people before we close out here?
Yeah, sure. I want to mention just one thing, because we've been talking about it a lot. The event in Lakeland that had the Nazi disruption was led by a wonderful drag queen named Mama Ashley Rose, who's done a lot of great community work. It was at a venue called Art/IFACT Studios. I believe that's how you say it. And I just want to, make sure that
I get it.
Yeah. I just want to make sure that, we're not just like brushing over that these are real people that are doing great work in their community. And the story just doesn't become Nazis oppressed people. They are people, they do things, and they contribute to the community, and that's important.
Yeah. My local person that I always think of in that respect is our friend Joan Hepsworth from Tampa Paperback Exchange Bookstore. Listen, active every day in a supportive place every day to the community. And there are dozens of those kind of activist people in Pasco County, in my county here, my Scarlet Red, Trump supporting county. So there are certainly people like that in your neighborhood, your community. And as Brian and Sam both said, reach out to those people and ask if they're okay, what they need, how you can support them, what's helpful. Ask what's helpful. Don't assume what's helpful, because that's often a problem, right? So rather than think we know what people need, why don't we just ask them and go from there? So, all right, guys, thank you very much. That's going to wrap up our show for tonight. Thank you again to Kelly Smith, Realtor, for her generous support of our show, and for our 6 or 8 Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, it's on the scroll at the bottom there, how you can like and follow us here on Facebook and on Twitter for now. And that's about it, other than to say, as we like to say at the close of every show, Sasquatch is real. We'll see you guys next week.
And it's me.